All right, thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Burton Smith. You can reach me on Twitter at StephBreaker, or you can email me if you want, burton@breakstuff.io. Just a little bit about myself. I currently, for the last year and a half, work for Microsoft, working on their design systems and component library for a lot of their internal tooling. So I've had the opportunity to switch from full stack, Ethereum, the nebulous full stack environment, and really scope down into working specifically on design systems and implementations for that. It's been really exciting, very educational for me for the last year and a half. A couple more random things about me. I love playing the ukulele. That's really fun if you have never played the ukulele. And I did put that on there so you would know that both playing the ukulele is manly and sexy, because that's Ryan Gosling playing the ukulele right there. So just for your information. The other thing too is I'm a big fan of martial arts, practitioner of martial arts. I've been doing that since I was a kid and learned about Ninja Turtles and all that stuff. So I love doing martial arts as well. So if you want to talk about any of those things with me as well, I'm happy to have a chat with that. So I've put out a couple of open source projects over the years. The first one is Clarion. This was a systemized approach for managing styles and designs for web-based applications using things like Sass. And the other one is Kickstand UI. This is a web components-based design system or component library that can be used to basically plug and play anywhere. We'll talk a little more about web components, but this was a first iteration of an open source tool, and I'm working on the next iteration of that coming up here soon. So feel free to take a look at those and play around with them. They're out there for everyone to use. Now, really quick, before we get started with design, talking about design, how many of you are designers in here? Ooh, a couple. How many of you are engineers? Oh, how many of you are managers? Okay, cool. That's a nice little mix. Now, here's the problem that I usually have, is that I get this mentality that design systems are for designers, right? This unfortunate name, design systems, a lot of people just automatically assume this is for designers. So when I go to a tech conference and I start talking to engineers about it, they just kind of shut down a little bit, because they don't think that it's exactly relevant to them or what they're talking about. When in fact, I love this quote somebody else said, we whisper design, shout systems, right? That's the idea of systemizing our design. It's very much a strategic system thinking approach to how we orchestrate and scale our user experiences. I'm coming at it from a user engineer, from a software engineer perspective, gone designer a little bit, right? So for me, design systems are very much an engineering practice as well. So as I talk about things today, I'll actually be going through and explaining things kind of from a web perspective, because that's where my field of expertise is, and also because the web is kind of a wild, wild west out there in terms of being able to build and style things however you want to. A lot of native development is not as open and flexible as web allows you to be. So that's where design systems tend to really shine, is in the web and creating experiences on the web. All right, so let's start from the start, right? It really comes down to your brand. All right, I love this quote by Horst Schultz. It says, don't be a name is not a brand. If a name makes a promise and lives up to the promise anywhere in the world, then it's a brand. And so what I want you to think about, a fun little exercise, like if I told you today that Nike is gonna start making hotels, I'm sure in your mind, you can already start to imagine what that hotel would kind of be like, right? You understand Nike's brand well enough to be like, oh, kind of, a sports theme maybe. They might have basketball hoops and, things like that. You can already start to put together the brand. Whereas if I said the Marriott's going to start making shoes, you might not be able to imagine that as well, right? You might not be able to have that solid brand in your head to be able to make the reverse in action. Now, when we start talking about design systems, we need to know where we're coming from a brand perspective, to say, okay, this is the way our brand is. This is the way we want people to look and feel about our brand, and this is what we represent, because then that is going to inform the rest of your decisions when it comes to creating your design system. Now, we're going to break it down into a couple different parts. So there's design system, which is this global, holistic idea. And then there's smaller parts that kind of help build up our design system as well, which is the pattern library and the style guide. So let's talk about design systems exactly. This quote from Hack the Design System, it says, a design system is a living system of guidelines, reusable code, design assets, and tools that help organizations deliver consistent, on-brand experiences at scale and over time. Right? So our design system is now this really kind of big idea. It's this big idea where we're going to say, all right, how do we want to represent ourselves? How do we want to start building our applications, right? This is our way of really identifying and documenting how do we build, how do we want our applications built, and what do we want them to be like, right? So documenting is the first step. Even if you don't have a website or anything yet, pull up a Google Doc, I don't care, a notepad, whatever, and just start thinking about ideas about what you want to achieve. Now I'm going to tell you, I'm going to throw out some ideas here. These are just ideas to get you started, okay? These are by no means completely exhaustive list of what you're going to need, but I'm going to tell you right now, if you're starting your design system for the first time right now, it's probably going to stink the first time, and that's okay. All right, I'm going to give you that permission. It's okay to totally not be great on your first iteration because guess what? Design systems are iterative. You're going to be continuing to grow and evolve these over time, right? So as we document it, first thing you want to do, okay, start identifying some core principles that you want in your design system. Right? Why are we doing things this way? What do we want to do? What do we want to achieve with our design system? Why are we even doing this from the start? Why don't we just grab something else off the shelf? Why don't we use Bootstrap? Right? Why don't we use Material UI? Whatever. You guys, there's so many options out there. Why are we building our own? What are we trying to achieve by building our own? The other thing you want to think about is, what are some other key important factors that are going to play into the way that we do this? Now, going through and, just as performance, accessibility, technical considerations, are we building for phones? Are we building for desktop users? There's going to play, all these things are going to start playing into it. That it's good to think about up front so that as you start building it, it's easy to bake them in up front and then iterate on top of them afterwards. Now, some of these things, you'll just document on a high level, but it's never a good idea to just be like, we want to be performant, right? We want to be accessible. What does that mean? Well, I can tell you right now, Microsoft, we have the accessibility standard, like the WCAG standard, right? That's a good starting place. But Microsoft has gone a step above that and said, you know what? Yes, that's our minimum, but we also have these other areas where we want to have accessible user experiences that aren't just meeting the standard, but are nice, right? That excel above the standards. So they created an additional set of standards above the WCAG standard to say all of our applications now must also meet these constraints, all right, or these usability requirements. Because we believe in making them more accessible than what the standard is. So it's really important that as you start doing these things and you start making these decisions that they become documented. So that way, whenever someone comes back and says, why? Because I can guarantee you this, you will get that question a lot, especially if you have a lot of people who are using your design system. That question, why, is going to come up every single day. Because everyone is going to want to do something their own way. They're like, well, why aren't you doing it like this component library is doing it? Why aren't you doing it like this NPM package I found? Or this random way that my stepbrother's friend's cousin's sister built in their website? Why aren't you doing it this way? It's good to try to think of these things and have a good answer to fall back on to say, here's why. Right? So start documenting that, even from the beginning. Start with something small, and then start iterating on top of that and expanding out from there. Now, one of the most important things that I wish I had heard from the start was start simple and document as you go. Simple sells, all right? Start simple because it's so much easier to add than it is to take away, right? Start with something very small, isolated, and start documenting as you build on top of that. Because I learned from Kickstand very quickly that building it, that's easy. That's the fun part. Going back and documenting it, Oh, that's a slog, right? There's a lot of work that goes into documenting it. Whereas had I done that as I went, it would not nearly have been this humongous chore that I had to do at the end. So as you document, as you build, as you create ideas, come up with things, start documenting it. So one, you have that why in case somebody comes back and asks, and you can point them to something, but also because documentation is hard. That's probably the hardest part, documenting well. So start doing it as you go. And sometimes you don't remember why you did something. It made sense at the time when you built it, but because you didn't document it when you did it, you totally forgot. So document as you go. Now, the key thing, though, is that you want to make sure that you start making decisions, right? This is you're systemizing your design. You are adding opinions to why you're doing things the way they are, right? And you want to stick with them as best you can. You're saying, hey, this is the way that we want to do it because we want them to be consistent. We want them to be on brand. We want them to be, to match as you move from one experience to another. So this is why we're doing it this way, right? And stick with it. But I'm going to add this little caveat. You got to be flexible, right? As you start adding in new experiences or as you start adding in new designers or new engineering teams, they can come with new ideas or new ways to expand the way you're thinking about things. So you got to be a little bit flexible to say, okay, here's how we're going to grow and iterate on this. Now, one of the challenges that we run into is that people are saying, oh, it's too constraining, right? You're going to tell me that I have all of the colors in the web to choose from, and you're going to shoehorn me into these 6 colors that I can choose from, and they're going to say it's too constraining. There's no way. There's no good reason for that. I'm going to come back and say, with this quote, creativity thrives under intelligent constraints. Now, this is kind of a two-edged sword. One, it's kind of to help push back and say, hey, we're hiring you because you're creative. We want you to find creative. These are the bounds in which we've implemented our design system, and we want you to work within those bounds. Those are the guidelines we want, unless you have a really compelling reason, and we'll take it back to the team, internalize it, whatever it may be, but here are the guidelines. Now, the other edge of that sword is that make sure you're making intelligent decisions. Make sure you're not doing it just because. You're like, well, that's how Bootstrap does it, so that's why we did it that way, right? Really make sure you understand the why of why you're doing something so that you can point them back to it and help educate. The amount of time I spend educating other teams blew my mind. I never thought I would spend this much time. I spend probably a third of my time engineering, a third of my time with other technical lead type stuff, and another third of my time just educating the users of our components. Here's how you use components. Here's why you use it that way. Here's why we chose to engineer these components the way we did. There's a lot of education involved in this. So it's really, really important that those constraints are well understood and well documented. All right, now the success of your design system is always going to be measured about not how many components you have, not how fast they are, but actually how much your team and your users are using your design system, right? You want them to use it. You want them to be following the patterns that you've laid out for them. Now, one of the challenges that I've run into with using various component libraries and design systems, they don't meet up to 3 criteria. And those criteria are they need to be flexible. They need to be able to meet the needs of whatever someone is using, right? They need to be able to be plugged and played wherever they need to be used effectively. I've used a couple of components where they're so big and configurable that they're brittle, right? And they just don't fit the needs that I need them to fit in. All right, they need to be easy to use. Again, with that giant configuration, because of the setup time and everything required to do that, it makes it incredibly difficult to plug those in and start using them. Where it gets to the point where we're like, just don't touch it. Just don't touch it. It's working right now. Don't even breathe on it, right? You just don't want to do anything. You're just like, it's there. Just talk quietly around it, okay? So you don't want that, right? You want you want durable components that you can just plug in there and people can use with confidence, right? And they need to be reliable. One of the best things about a design system is that you have the ability to publish quality in your components, right? If you're using a component library that they can pull in as a package or pull in as a reference or whatever it may be, and you're baking quality into that, as you make a change, a quality improvement, that then gets propagated throughout the rest of your applications, right? So this quality is a central part of what makes a design system successful, because you want them to feel that they can build with confidence with those, whatever tools you're providing them with. So now as we break down and go down into the smaller parts, we've got a pattern library. Now the pattern library is actually where kind of the rubber meets the road, right? This is where we take those ideas that we've outlined in the design system, maybe we've created pictures or designs for, and this is where we say, okay, let's take these and let's make them scalable. Right? We want to make them able to be portable and used wherever we need to. So the pattern library is how we materialize the ideas that we created in our design system, right? And we want to make them easy to use, easy to pick up, and portable throughout our application. So we create these patterns in our pattern library. Now, pattern library, most of you have, how many of you have heard of Atomic Design by Brad Frost? All right, he was kind of like one of the grandfathers when it comes to like design systems and this idea of this incremental build, right? You start with your atoms, your smallest building blocks, and then you start building, then you have molecules as you combine these things, and then into organisms. And then his analogy kind of falls apart where it's like templates and pages. You know, it doesn't really make sense, but it's this idea that they're kind of built on top of each other, right? So we kind of follow a similar process where we have our design tokens, which are our smallest building blocks. And then we have elements, which are the smallest building block in whatever platform we're using. So for us, the web, it's our anchors, it's our buttons, it's our whatever they may be. You can't break them down any smaller, right? Then we have our components, which then are composed of elements. And then we have our layouts, which are composed of components. And then we have our pages, which are composed of layouts and components, right? So the idea is that you want to make sure that every layer can then build on top of itself. You don't have any weird outliers that are outside of your system that are contributing to it, because the moment those start moving around and changing, it starts messing with your design system. So you really want to try to have this be an ecosystem unto itself, okay? So where do you start with this, okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is a little philosophical here, right? This is the 5 fundamentals of UX, and this is a headspace that I ask anyone to get into, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a manager, whether you're a designer, whether you're a product manager, or the CEO, I don't care. This is the headspace that you should be in anytime you want to create a product. And this is the 5 fundamental questions of UX. The first one is, who are my users and audience? Who am I building this for? Right? What problems are they trying to solve? They've come to you to solve a problem. What is it? How can we help them solve that problem? What do we want them to do? Because we want something out of them too, right? And if you're saying number 4 is the same answer as number 2, I'm going to challenge you and say you're probably not thinking hard enough, okay? Because we probably want them to do something different than they came to do, right? We want them to sign up. We want them to buy a product, whatever it may be. We want something from them. And last of all, how do we incentivize them to do that? So now with those 5 questions in mind, if you don't already have an existing application, draw one, all right? This doesn't have to be fancy. You don't have to pull out a really cool design tool. You can do this on a napkin, piece of paper, whatever it may be. I intentionally chose this image because it looks ugly, right? And it's this user experience first. And what that means is I want you to think about, what are we trying to have, what are they trying to do? We're going to ask those 5 questions. And we're going to map it out as a user interface to say, okay, here's how they get to this. Here's how they eventually get to this point where they get what they want. And here's how they eventually get to the point where we get what we want from them, right? Draw it out, even if you don't know for sure. You're just making it up. That's okay. That's better than most people, right? So even if you just are guessing, good start. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take those elements that you've identified and said, hey, we're going to need these things to get them from A to B to C to D. Okay, we're going to need buttons, we're going to need paragraphs, we're going to need carousel. I hope you don't need a carousel, just FYI. Carousels are not great UX, but let's say you need something like that. Then you can say, okay, here's everything that we need. Whoops, skipped ahead. And then you can start sorting out, start grouping them into categories and saying, okay, here's what we need, here's how we're going to do it, and start building from there, right? From that very basic set of steps. Here's what we want them to look like. Here's how they're going to get to that journey that we want them to be on. That is a great start. Now, if you're starting from an existing application, this is a fun little game. It's called UI Audit. That's where you go through and you say, what do we have already on our site? Now, this may get kind of complicated because some sites are humongous, right? So start with the key customer journeys, what we call the happy path, right? Here's the happy path where the seller is, or the buyer, the customer is starting on here, and here's how they eventually get to buying our product, or here's how they eventually get to signing up for our newsletter, or here's how they eventually get to blah, 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 right? Start with that happy path to say, here's how they get to A to Z. This is what we want them to do within the application, even if maybe sometimes they don't always do that. Here's what we want, right? Then what you're going to do with that happy path, you can do the same thing and say, well, what do we need exactly for them to get to that happy path? And start building from there. Because if you start with everything that's on your site right now, guess what? That's going to take forever, all right? Design systems are iterative. Start with the small things first and start building on top of it. Really try to find and identify areas where you can progressively enhance your application so that your design system can progressively be adopted throughout its life cycle, okay? Next one is, sorry, I kind of skipped that. Identify those patterns, right? Identify the patterns that you're finding in there, and then consolidate and create consistency. Now, there are some tools out there. One of them, I did a workshop one time where we actually went through an application where we went through and printed out the website, and said, okay, here's the customer journey map that we want to map out. And we actually went through and cut out all the little pieces of the customer journey. We're like, oh, here's a little pile of buttons. Like, it's kind of fun, right? And so you could see all the different variations of buttons that we had throughout the site. And we said, oh, maybe they're not so consistent from one part of the site to another. How do we now create consistency with our buttons so they all look and feel the same? So the other tool that is a really good one, and this may not necessarily be exactly what you want for an audit, but it's a very good measurement tool. It's a thing called CSSstats.com. You can go on there and drop in your website, and what it will do is it'll grab your CSS and say, okay, here's all of your colors that you used in here. Here's all the font sizes you used in here. Here's all of your Z indexes you use in here, all of that stuff. It'll start to serialize and categorize it and give you some information feedback on that. Really cool for two reasons. One, it'll give you an idea to say, okay, what do we have in here and what do we actually need? The other thing too is this is an amazing before and after snapshot tool. One of my favorite ones to test in this is the BBC website before they implemented their design system and after. It is amazing to see the difference. The color palette significantly shrunk. It got standardized. It looks very consistent. It's really awesome. And the size of their CSS also got significantly smaller. So their user experience improved too from that aspect. So fun tool. I highly recommend it, even if you just want to play around and see what other sites are doing. You can kind of measure. You can see, once you play with this and drop in some sites, which sites are using a design system and which sites are not using a design system. It's pretty informative. Now, an important note, again, if you don't need it, don't build it. We've run into this, and this is actually something we're actively fighting within our existing component library. On the first iteration, the team that was building it was very excited about the idea of actually building a component library and publishing it out there. And they were like, whatever you need, we're going to put in here. And so we had like 15 different variations of cards in there, some with links, some without links, some where the image was clickable, some where the image wasn't clickable. And so we have all these like variations of the same thing, but they're all different components. And rather than consolidating them into a single component, we now have to maintain all of them separately. So now we're in the process of cleaning that up, consolidating it, making it simpler, because we don't want to have to manage and support all of those different variations, especially if it was some random use case for that one instance being used, right? We really want to make sure we tighten it up and say, here are our common use cases, here are our core user experiences, and that's what we're building to. It's okay to introduce nuance in your application that's outside of the design system. I mean, don't shoot me for saying that, but it's okay. It's okay to not always follow exactly what the design system does, but make sure that you are in line with your brand and your design, your overall design of the look and feel you're trying to achieve. So, again, if you don't need it, don't build it, because that means you got to support it, and that is a nightmare when you get stuck supporting something that you know you don't need. All right, so now let's start with breaking it down. Some of the things you want to start looking for as you're doing that audit. The first one, design tokens. Now, this list is not an exhaustive list of all the design tokens that you're going to want to collect here, but what you want to do is you want to be able to say, okay, here is a focused set of these things, and we've chosen this focus set so that it's easy for you to implement, right? Something that's really important is the laws of UX. Everyone familiar with the laws of UX? You ever heard of it? If you haven't heard of it, look up the laws of UX. Those laws of UX are talking about user experience. I've got really, really important news. Those laws of UX are laws of people, right? People, these are laws for people. So the laws of UX also apply to DX, developer or design experience. Right? So we want to make sure that as we tokenize things, we create a curated list that make it easy for our designers and our engineers also to use those tokens, right? So for example, it's amazing once you start using these tokens and start plugging them in, how much simpler your application becomes and how much easier it becomes to manage. Perfect example. Everyone familiar with Z-index? Yeah, if you don't know what that is, in web development, you have the ability of controlling the Z-index. And what that means is it controls how the vertical layering of something. So if you want something to appear on top of something else within your user interface, you control it with the Z-index. Now, in web development, if what you're trying to create is not on top of what you want, what do? You change the Z-index to 9999, right? Now, if that doesn't work, what do? You just keep adding nines on top of the end until you finally get to the top, right? Now, I'm going to tell you, as soon as you start using design tokens, that problem all of a sudden goes away, right? When you've predefined what your Z-indexes are, and there's usually like 3 or 4, maybe 5 Z-indexes that you use, your application seems to work so much better when it comes to layering. It's magic, all right? Now, the other thing, too, is that when you start adding too many tokens, it can become overwhelming. We want to make sure we start small. Again, start simple. All right, this is an old color palette from Material UI. I can tell you right now, this idea of analysis paralysis or Hicks law, too many options, it can be paralyzing for engineers and designers when they're trying to be like, well, what color of blue should I actually choose for this thing? And there's just so many options over here. Guess what? It makes it really hard to build consistent applications when there's too many options. Start small. Start with 5. 5 is a good number. Maybe go to 7 if 5's not enough. And then if that's not enough, go to 9. Okay? But start small. It's easier to add than it is to remove. Okay? This is too many. I'm going to tell you that right now. That's just way too many dang colors right there. Okay. All right, naming conventions. Naming is hard, but I will say it's really important to make sure that you, especially with color tokens, that you choose colors that are generic. Okay? And the reason why is because as you move from one brand to another, those color tokens will change. So if I name my primary color token Blue 500, and all of a sudden I have to implement it in another application where the primary color is green, it's going to be really confusing if I'm using Blue 500 to describe green, right? So start with some generic colors, just generic labels for your colors and things like that. Primary, secondary, warning, danger, success, whatever they may be, start with some generics. The other thing too is that, try to keep things. Same thing with fonts right here, it's the same thing, right? You have your base font, your accent font, your monospace. If you're using more than 3 fonts, you're doing something wrong, right? You want to make it simple. We want to keep it clean, easy to use, easy to understand for our users. And last, keep your scales intuitive, right? Here we have an extra small, small, medium, large. We see 100 to 500 or 100 to 900. We see these different scales, but you want to make sure that whatever your scale is intuitive to your engineers and your designers so that they can easily pick them up and be like, oh, I know if I'm going from 500 to 600, I'm going to a darker color, or vice versa. Just make sure the scale matches whatever you're trying to do. Or if I'm going from a small to large, I know it's going to be whatever it is going to be bigger, whether it's a padding or a margin or font size, whatever it may be, right? Use intuitive scaling, use intuitive labels that make it easy for you to understand what's happening. Next thing is make them easy to use, all right? Use them. There's all kinds of, let me back up. There's all kinds of tools out there to help us use these and access these, right? You can store them as JSON objects. You can store them as CSS variables, SAS maps, whatever they may be. But whatever medium you're using, you want to make sure that it's easy for developers and designers to grab and go with them, right? The easier you do that, the greater the success you will see with the adoption of your design system. So a quick example that we've seen is the idea of CSS utility classes, right? I want to be able to create these utility classes so that developers can just, without having to wire up a whole bunch of stuff, start implementing their design tokens right in the UI, right away. So in that top one, we see margin top and margin bottom being set using our design tokens. And there's not a lot of overhead for them, right? The barrier to entry to start using the design tokens is very low here. That's what we want. We want the barrier of entry to our design system to be low. Same thing if they're writing within their CSS, right? We want to be able to have intuitive tools for them to start using wherever they're building to get up and going quickly with it. The greater the barrier to entry for it, the lower the success you'll see with your design system. Now, elements. I think more and more libraries are moving towards this idea of component developed engineering, right? Component-based engineering, where you're using a framework of some kind or a way of abstracting out your user interface into these reusable components. Now, the one thing that I will say is make sure that whoever's using your component library is starting with a level playing field. And that's where things like your CSS resets come in. Make sure you're setting your CSS resets that are based on your design tokens, right? Your anchors should be the right color blue by default. Your line height should be the right height by default. Your paragraph and your fonts should be using the right styles by default. Allow your engineers and your developers to fall into the pit of success, right? Provide them with something so that no matter what they're doing, it's always going to be right. Okay, provide them with the CSS tools so that they can easily start using and looking the way you want it to. Now with components, this is where a lot more people are starting to use these front-end frameworks for componentizing our user experiences, right? We want to make sure they're reusable. You don't want to hard code these instances into a single user experience. We want to make them kind of agnostic, right? We want to make sure they're configurable and that they can configure like variations of the buttons and the styles so that they look and feel on brand, but still be flexible enough to fit in different situations, right? You don't always want to use your primary button in one way. You want to have a secondary or tertiary or a hollow button or whatever it may be to communicate differently throughout the application. So we got to build that variation into our components. Replaceable. And that's where we want to make sure that if we build a new set of buttons or a new set of carousels or a new set of dialogues, we can easily come in and swap them out without completely disrupting the user experience, right? We want to build them in an agnostic way so that they are, and actually that's the next one, is context agnostic. We want to make sure that they are unaware of their surroundings, that they run and live on their own, right? We want to make sure that if we swap them out or we change things, it's not going to completely disrupt our user experience or the application. And last, encapsulated. We want to make sure that styles are not leaking into our components or leaking out of our components. We want to make sure our styles stay isolated and that they're not dependent on the styles of what's around them. This gets really important because as soon as someone starts adding in another library or another tool, they can really start messing up your design system really fast. All right, perfect example. I was on an e-commerce platform where someone decided they wanted a specific select style. So they went and found this jQuery library and dropped this jQuery library in. Unfortunately, what they did is they selected with the jQuery library all selects instead of the specific select that they were working on. So now all of a sudden, all of our selects have this new treatment applied to them. Not only that, but they were also conflicting with the existing styles that were on our select. So now everything's broken just because someone wanted this specific select to look and behave a certain way. So we want to be able to build our tools that are a little more robust, that even if somebody goes in and does that, are not going to be overridden or disrupted because somebody drops something else in and completely ruins what we've done, worked really hard to build, right? And last but not least, you want to make them dumb. All right, there are smart components or features, or whatever they may be, but you want your component to be dumb. You don't want them to be aware of your server. You don't want them to be aware of credentials. You don't want them to be aware of other things, right? Your components should be basically what we call leaf level components, right? They're there for rendering and there for displaying. They don't have a ton of logic that's interacting with user information or shopping cart information or things like that. We want them to be dumb and there for display purposes. That increases our portability and our reusability of those components. And it's this whole idea of composability, right? We want to be able to take our Lego blocks in this situation and recompose them into something else if we need to, right? We don't want to build a hard-coded login form that only can be used in one place. Instead, we want to build inputs and buttons and a form element that then can be reused in other places for the newsletter sign-up form or be reused for a contact us page or whatever it may be. We want them to be agnostic, right, and dumb so that we can mix them up and make new and cool things with them. Now, this is a fun little activity. Names are important, and this is incredibly hard. Naming is hard. If you go to the design system, there's a design system Slack channel out there. If you're not a part of it, I recommend you join it. They actually have a channel on their Slack called Naming is Hard, where they go in and they say, what is this thing called? What should I name this thing? All right, so a quick activity. Just yell out as you hear it. What is this thing called? Modal? Dialogue. Anything else? Pop-up? Okay. Go away. All right. How about this thing? What's this thing called? Snack bar, toast, alert. There's something called growler one time. That was kind of a cool name, I thought. Okay. How about this last one? Tooltip. All right. Now, I'll tell you right now that I was in a meeting one time with some sales, management, a whole bunch of people were brainstorming some ideas where every single one of these things was called a pop-up. So when someone comes to you and says, hey, we need a pop-up that does blah, 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 what the heck am I going to choose here? Like, what are they talking about? I have no idea, right? Naming things is important. Now, more importantly than what you name them is that you use them. You use the names and you enforce the names, right? And here's the thing that I run into. I get people who they're like, oh, I'm not technical. I don't know the names. I can't learn the names of these things. Oh, come on, you learn the names of your kids and people's kids, and you learn the names of dogs, and you can learn the name of these things. This is not rocket science, all right? So enforce that. Enforce it so that this now becomes a communication tool. Right? There's a reason why sometimes design systems are called DSLs or design system languages, because this now becomes a conduit of communication. So now when I go in and they say, I want a dialogue, boom, I know exactly what they're talking about. Oh, I want a toast. Well, that's what we're calling that. I know exactly what they're talking about. We need a tooltip, boom. Now, this reduces the friction that comes from the handoff aspect of it, right? So one of the challenges that we run into is that as people are communicating to us, we don't always get a clear picture of what they want. And when we present to them what we've created, they're like, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I was looking for. You guys don't know what you're doing, right? Oh, that's so frustrating. I've heard that so many times. But the reality is that we just need to work on communication. Design systems are great at that. They're a great tool for communicating, okay? Now, layouts and pages, I'm not going to go that deep into, and that's primarily because, well, I wrote this a little while ago, and I said they're composed of design system elements, but they're not typically part of the design system itself. Since writing this, we've created a layout component that we use at work now, and it has been wildly successful. So we have more and more teams using a layout component. So you never know, right? It depends on your implementation, but for the most part, layouts or your user experiences are compositions of different components. So layouts, pages, the idea is that those will all be built on top of your component library, your design tokens, and whatever tooling you've provided to them. Now, design tools. Now, there's really great design system tools out there, right? These are some really good applications that you can install and start creating mock-ups and designs with. And I'm going to put out a little hot take here. If you're building a design system, you don't need these. And I only say that because I don't want that to be a barrier to entry for you to build a design system. The tooling that you use, using a design tool, should not be a barrier to entry for creating a design system. You can be an engineer and start building a design system right now without ever touching one of these tools, and that's okay. Now, what these are really good for, these are fantastic communication tools. These are great tools to conceptualize a design and be able to hand it off to somebody else, right? These are a great way to communicate intent and design. So these are important, these are great, but I do want to emphasize they are not critical for creating your design system. So, but I do recommend you check them out. Figma is fantastic. That seems to be the leader in terms of creating design systems because they have design systems on the brain, right? You can put your tokens in there. You can help build components, create variations of those components. They've done a fantastic job with it. There's a reason why Adobe bought them instead of using XD, right? Because they were like, you guys did it really well. Good job. So they bought Figma, and it's a fantastic tool. Highly recommend it. Plus, it's web-based and native-based, so it doesn't matter what kind of platform you're working on. It's great. So one of the other things that is important to take note of is the technical considerations. Where are you building this? This is the landscape of my last company that I was working at, where we had to make sure that our design system could scale to all of these different environments. Well, that's really hard to do, right? Oh, sorry, we wrote it in React. It doesn't fit in any of those, right? That's becomes the problem. Now, if you're a React shop and you do everything React, and that's the way you write all of your applications, yeah, write it in React. That's great. Now, if you have to be able to span across multiple platforms, it gets a little bit harder. Now, that's for that reason specifically. Design systems have made a new friend with kind of an old technology. Does anyone know what that logo is for? Yeah, web components. Web components has been around since HTML5. Haven't really gotten a lot of love up until IE died, thank goodness. Once IE died, the support for web components shot through the roof because that was really the thing that was sandbagging everything. So web components are a standard, HTML standard-based way of composing components that are platform agnostic, right? They're completely interoperable depending on your framework that you're working on. So that's why, like Microsoft right now, we're working on Web Component Library because we have to be able to support React, Vue, .NET, Angular, Svelte, whatever it may be. We need to make sure that our component library can be used in there. We don't want to rebuild it for each one of those platforms. We want to build it once, ship it everywhere. That's kind of the promise of web components, and it's been really nice. I won't say it's a silver bullet for everything, but man, it really has saved a ton of time and effort. So it's something if you're looking at a similar landscape that we're looking at, web components might be a great tool for you. One last technical tool that I'm going to mention right now is Storybook. If you're not already using Storybook to write your component library, I highly recommend it for two reasons. Storybook is a way of authoring and composing your components in isolation, right? You create these stories that are isolated from everything else in your application where you work specifically on that component and making sure that component sings, right? That's what Storybook does a great job. It allows you to really break your application out into smaller chunks. The other thing, too, a lot of teams are doing is using Storybook for their documentation site. Now, documentation, again, very difficult. Not very difficult, please. I don't want you to be like shutting down because I said it's hard. But it can be. It's complex, right? A lot of these applications, a lot of these components have a lot of nuance to them, a lot of sophistication to them. So being able to document that in a meaningful way can be hard. And Storybook tries to help you with that because it's aware of your components and what is building your components and the different properties and attributes and whatever it may be that comprise your components. It tries to help fill in the gaps for you and then gives you a good platform to then host documentation and an interactive environment to play with that. So take a look at Storybook if you haven't already. Now, when it comes to documentation, an important thing to keep in mind is you want to be able to document where and when to use your component. This is from the Fluent documentation on toggle, right? When do you use a toggle? When don't you use a toggle? Is a toggle supposed to be used like a checkbox? In this instance, no. Don't use a toggle like a checkbox. You should be using it as something else. This has a different purpose than a checkbox, right? You want to be able to communicate that so people don't start using things wherever they want to, and you have a good set of guidelines for them to work with. In addition to that, you want to make sure you document how to actually use your component. All right, here's how you configure this. Here's how you get the variations of the components that we want. Here's how you get that blue button versus that green button. Or here's how you get the animation to work one way versus another for your dialogue, right? You want to be able to have that kind of flexibility with your component, but you need to make sure you document it. Otherwise, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to use it. So we want to make sure we provide good examples and good opportunities for them to succeed with these components. Now, the last piece, we talk about the design system as a whole. We've talked about pattern libraries. Now let's talk about style guides. Now, style guides is this unique implementation where we say, okay, here's how we are implementing the design system in this application. Now, there may be times where you only have one application you're implementing it for, so that's pretty easy. Now, there may be times where you have multiple applications with different variations. You want to be able to document and say, hey, here's how this is implemented, and here's how it varies or deviates from the design system, right? So an important thing, and I hear this a lot, a style guide is not the same as your brand guidelines. Brand guidelines are a lot of times incorporating print and marketing type materials or things like that. This is not. This is purely around documenting, here's how this user experience was engineered. Here's how we've taken the implementation of the design system into this application, right? So some things to think about. Answer those 5 UX questions again, because if they're different, they're probably going to be different from one application to another, right? Your marketing or your content site is going to have a different set of answers to that question as your e-commerce site. So answer those 5 questions. Then go through and identify voice and tone, aesthetics, graphics and images. How are those going to vary in this implementation? And start documenting those. Then you're going to go through in your design tokens and say, okay, how do we need to tweak our design tokens to make sure this meets this new set of criteria? Now, if you look at the olden days of like old Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel, those did not exactly look the same from one to another, right? Then gradually over time, they kind of look more and more, but still, there's still little tokens that get switched, right? Word has their blue, Excel has their green, PowerPoint has their orange, right? And so there's going to be these variations that change from one implementation to another. And you got to document those. That's where your style guide comes into play. You want to be able to document and say, hey, we know this is how the design system works. This is how we're doing it in this application. Here's how we're deviating, or here's how we're reinforcing that within this application. That style guide becomes critical as you start scaling your applications out to multiple platforms, okay? So then it comes back to this idea. Now, there may be instances where we have, this is where we're at right now at Microsoft with all kinds of things. We have so many platforms using all different kinds of styles. We have Are we a house of brands or are we a branded house? It depends. Microsoft is moving much, much more to branded house, right? They want to have everyone using their Fluent design system so that everything starts to look and feel like a consistent Microsoft product, whereas before, it was kind of their own thing. There was some kind of consistencies from one area to another. But now, there's some variation. We want to be able to capture that variation when it does exist. Even within where I'm at right now in Microsoft in our small little area. So I work on the Partner Center portal. That's where people go in and buy their bulk licenses for Xbox and Office 365 and Windows and all that stuff. Now, people really liked what we did there, so now these other applications, we have a Dynamics MSX implementation, they're like, hey, we like that. We're going to start stealing it. We're going to start using your components in here. Oh, okay, we got to create some variations, thank you. Some variations in there for that now. Oh, so we have a theme here, we have a theme here. Oh, now we need this core experience that's going to ship with our sovereign implementation that is this vanilla implementation that it doesn't have a specific theme. Oh, okay, so we got this one here. And now we have these other platforms that keep adding it. Now we need to be able to scale that variation in a meaningful way, right? So that's where being able to have a systemized approach for your style guide becomes incredibly meaningful. The other thing that's important to do is that as you start incorporating all of these different environments or expanding your application or your implementation, it's important to know that you will change and you will grow and your design system will evolve and it will morph into something that maybe it didn't start out the same as it did before, but the important thing is that you keep iterating to make it better and you keep documenting those iterations, right? Now I'm going to leave you, we only have 10 minutes left. I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Seth Godin. Great projects are gardens. They are tended, they shift, they grow. They endure over time, gaining a personality and reflecting their environment. When something dies or fades away, we prune, replant, and grow again. By all means build, but don't finish, don't walk away. Awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Do we have any questions? Yes. Man, that's a loaded question right there. Okay, so the question was, so there's a concept within web components called the shadow DOM. And the shadow DOM allows you to create a sub-DOM that exists outside of the flow of the rest of the document, right? And so that means any styles that are added to that shadow DOM are scoped exactly to that shadow DOM. They don't bleed out and they don't leak in. The question has that helped with the the style isolation and preventing things from affecting our styles? 100% that has. That has been one of the key elements in making sure that our design system maintains consistency no matter what other developers are bringing in as additional component libraries or additional styles within their application. So yes, that aspect of web components has been incredibly helpful. Now, what are some other nuances to web components that may have been difficult? I have a whole nother talk on web components that I could do. I don't want to fill the time with this, but I would love to chat with you a little bit later. But web components, I will say, have a learning curve. This idea of a shadow DOM has great power and great capabilities, but there's a learning curve that comes with that. So it's important to know that that you need to be aware of what nuances exist with working with a shadow DOM. Any other questions? Yeah.
So from Discord, what do you think of Tailwind for design systems? Thinking specifically of what you said about generic terms for sizes. Tailwind uses explicit numbers for margin and padding rather than more generic terms.
Yeah. So what do I think of Tailwind for a design system? So Tailwind is a good design system in terms of standardizing the token aspect and the style aspect of it. Now, to me, that's only part of it, right? That's only part of the design system. There's a lot more that goes into it with accessibility, interactivity. You have JavaScript aspects to it. right? You need those parts to be identified and used for things like dialogues or carousels or other interactive elements on the page. So Tailwind, I think, is a good start for a lot of people. A lot of people like Tailwind because it's CSS class-based, similar to what I had displayed up there, where you say, hey, margin M-1, and that adds a size 1 margin onto something, right? It's a utility library. It has the ability to be very light and very lean and very fast, especially for development uptime. But there is some trade-offs that come with it that you need to be aware of. You're moving the complexity from your CSS into your DOM, which makes it less portable sometimes. But if you're componentizing things, then maybe it's not as difficult. So there are a lot of things that you need to take into consideration with a tool like Tailwind that could make things difficult. Thank you. Yes? Ooh, Raphael's the worst. No, my favorite is Michelangelo, hands down. He's the party dude. Come on. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you're identifying the principles of your design system, one of the things that you could identify is to say, hey, we want to make sure that we have a platform agnostic experience. We want to make sure that we have, I'm trying to think of, I can't think of any right now, but like you just, really the principles are, why are we doing this, right? We have some ambitions that we're trying to achieve that we want to accomplish with this. Why do this way when we know we could probably grab something off the shelf and try to shoehorn our design into that? Why are we doing it the way we want it to? So there's some principles that come with that, like either, hey, we're going to build it lightweight and open and allow teams to build on top of that whatever they want, or no, we want to be a locked-in experience. We want them to follow our guidelines exactly. Those kind of principles will really determine how you start building things and how teams begin interacting with your design system. So it's really important from the start to say, okay, what are our ambitions with this for those who are going to be using our design system, and how do we make sure we enforce that or reinforce that with teams? Do we have management buy-in who are going to help strong arm this, or do we have to just hope that our product is so sticky that people want to do it? They're just going to jump all over it because it's so great, right? So you have to start thinking about where are we going with this and how are we getting there, and those will inform your principles. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes. So there is the Fluent design system. Oh, yeah, sorry. The question was, does Microsoft have the same design system for their desktop software as they do for their web software? So there is a core design system called the Fluent design system, and that is used to design both Windows and the web experience. Now, I will say they're not a one-for-one parity right now. The goal is to get everything into a single parity, and there's a new version of Fluent actually coming very soon called Fluent 2, which I think both the web and the desktop experience, as well as the application experience for both, for like Office Suite and all of those things, are going to try to converge into. Because the Office Suite was originally Fabric, right? Fabric was one thing, and then they came up with Fluent, and now they're trying to eventually merge those two into the same thing. So a little history there for you if you were interested. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I'm here the rest of the day if anyone wants to come down and chat. Thank you very much for coming.